Hey everyone, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Today I'm doing a special bonus episode. This is a rewind episode from a talk that I did several years ago. This was a talk that I did at a number of professional conferences and for different professional astrology groups around the country. And also something that maybe four years ago now was a gift through my Kickstarter campaign. This is a talk on the mystical nature of Saturn. One of the things that happens is when we start studying astrology, we learn about Saturn and we learn a lot of things that are not, unfortunately, true. Well, we learn only some things that are true, and a lot of things get left out when it comes to Saturn. So in this talk, I present the mystical history of Saturn and why Saturn was a planet associated with things like astrology and mysticism and mystical experiences. I think you will really enjoy this as a way of filling out your understanding of the planet Saturn. And so I thought we would put this up as a bonus episode, as we're also trying to promote the Kickstarter in the final days right now. So on that note, before we get into it, remember to like and subscribe, share your comments and reflections if you got them. You can find transcripts of any of these daily talks on the website, nightlightastrology.com. We still need around over 1,200 backers to go in our annual Kickstarter campaign. We have a long ways to go and only a little over a week plus to go. So if you haven't yet pitched in to support the Kickstarter campaign, please consider doing so. Thank you to everybody who already has. You can find the link to donate at the top of the comment section, pinned to the top in the description of the video, or on the website, nightlightastrology.com. If you learn new things about planets or signs or houses, if as you listen to this throughout the year, you go, oh, I've never heard that about the sixth house before, or I've never heard that about Saturn before. If you learn something new, and this is a place that has you seeing things differently about commonly discussed symbols in astrology, then consider donating. That's something that we spend a lot of time making sure goes into the content, originality, and many different sides to the symbols that, and especially those that we don't always think about. So anyway, on that note, I hope you will enjoy this. And at the end of the video today, you'll hear me discussing the rewards that are available when you support the channel, including major discounts on all of our online programs and some other really good exclusive content you can get through the Kickstarter. A big thanks again to everyone who's already supported, and I hope you'll enjoy this bonus episode today. Bye.
Hi, everyone. This is Achyuta Bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and this is a special talk called The Mystical Saturn. Saturn is a planet that means a lot to me because I was born with a Capricorn moon and in a nighttime chart. So I've had to kind of make peace with Saturn, but in my attempt to understand myself and my life and Saturn, what I came to realize is that Saturn is often pretty misunderstood. It's a planet that has had a tremendous diversity of symbolic meanings and has been understood in many different ways by astrologers spanning several thousand years. One of the things that I feel is most misunderstood about Saturn is how mystical the planet is and how mystical its significations can be. Oftentimes, Saturn gets pegged with very earthy, kind of grounded, structured things. But it turns out that that is just one of its many qualities and that it is this deeply mystical planet. So I hope that you experience that same realization by listening to this talk, that your understanding and appreciation for Saturn increases because of this talk. I've done versions of this talk in the past, but this is a new and expanded edition of the talk as well. So if you've heard elements of this before, don't worry, there's a number of new elements to this talk, including a series of chart examples at the end, which I think do a really nice job of illustrating the mystical and otherworldly side of Saturn. So in this talk, we're going to cover the following topics. We're going to talk about the modern significations of Saturn. We're going to talk about Saturn and its relationship with the outer planets. Then we're going to talk about some of the traditional significations or meanings of Saturn in ancient astrology. We're going to talk about the joy of Saturn and its association with the 12th house. We're going to mention the discovery chart of Neptune, and then we're going to look at some chart examples. So that's our agenda for this talk today. So in modern astrology, the meaning of Saturn has changed, and as a result of emphasizing only certain aspects of Saturn's symbolism, we have lost touch with some of the more diverse ancient significations of the planet. In modern astrology, some of the most common significations of Saturn are as follows. Saturn is associated with time and karma, and these are words that are used very loosely, and oftentimes, as a result, they don't get explained well enough, or their association with Saturn isn't unpacked at a deep enough level. Hard work. Saturn gets associated with kind of hard, earthy work and tradition and values and things like that. Saturn is thought of as the teacher, but usually a kind of cranky teacher who's a taskmaster with a ruler that might rap you on the knuckles or something. Saturn gets associated with discipline and with structure. Saturn gets associated with restriction, constraint, and limitation. And all of these are, of course, true. And what we're going to do today is talk about why they're true, but why there's a lot more to Saturn than just these particular significations. Conservatism. Saturn gets associated with a resistance to change. I prefer the old typewriter. The old order, as well as authority and authoritarianism. And finally, responsibility and maturity. Now, I'm not going to debate or dispute that any of these have that any of these are not well matched to Saturn, any of these descriptions, qualities, or themes. But why are they associated with Saturn? And is there anything more to Saturn than just this? Well, first of all, in order to understand why Saturn is so different and why there's so much more to Saturn than we think there is, we need to talk about Saturn and the outer planets. Modern astrologers tended, especially in the early days of modern astrology, to glorify the outer planets as more evolved or sophisticated than the traditional 7 planets, especially Saturn. In fact, the term used to describe the outer planets is trans-Saturnian as well as transpersonal, and notice that that trans word usually means above or beyond. When this is taken on a psychological or metaphysical or philosophical level, it means that anything beyond Saturn is better, above, or somehow more evolved than Saturn. And because Saturn is the last of those traditional 7, in a weird way, Saturn takes on the meaning of all traditional 7 planets and tradition itself, and anything beyond Saturn is above or better than Saturn. For example, an early modern astrologer named Raymond Harrison once wrote this: "To those who can respond to their very high vibrations, Uranus and Neptune, and probably Pluto, denote the more highly cultivated types of humanity." So there was this belief that the old planets, signified by Saturn as the last of the traditional visible planets, are less evolved, or they represent lower vibrations compared to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Raymond Harrison also wrote, "It has been suggested that both Uranus and Neptune are the spiritual correspondents or counterparts of Mercury and Venus. They probably are in touch with elements of thought and feeling that are wholly inconceivable to the more mundane types of Mercury and Venus." So here, not only do you have the lower planets being looked down on in contrast to the outer planets, but you have them saying the outer planets are the spiritual counterparts to the more material lower planets. Similarly, an article from the Astrologers magazine in 1891 stated, "What our forefathers as astrologers lacked in deficient astronomical knowledge, through which much of what they said was regarded through a superstitious eye only, is more than replaced in modern times by advanced scientific knowledge." So the ancient traditional meanings of the planets, and in a sense, ancient astrology itself, was deficient compared to the new outer planets and the new science and the new world and the new age. Alan Leo, one of the godfathers of modern astrology, also wrote, "The ancients would frequently attribute partial effects to fallacious causes, hence the theory of terms and phases, which the experience of the present day lead us to reject. Substitutes were used to supply the place of the mystic planet Uranus in horary astrology. The old traditions were either lost or had become so corrupted and distorted that astrology could no longer be called a science, but rather a mere mode of divination." So there it is again, Alan Leo, one of the godfathers of modern astrology, basically saying ancient astrology is just, it's not scientific, it's just old, outdated divination. And the last of the visible planets is Saturn. And so Saturn comes to be associated with all that is old, outdated, superstitious, ancient hokum, compared to the brave, new, higher spiritual vibrations of this new age and our advanced scientific knowledge. So there's a real way in which Saturn starts picking up this bizarre projection. Leo also wrote that the Greeks held to the tradition of the Chaldeans for a time, but the study gradually became more an art than a science with them and had so far degenerated in its teachings that little trace of the original truths can be found in the Greek authors known to us, finally becoming nothing more than a form of divination. So again, same exact thing, but now he's basically saying that science is better than art or divination. And this mood is all projected almost entirely on the planet Saturn because these planets are trans-Saturnian. They go beyond the limits of Saturn, which starts to represent something about the old and the traditional and the outworn and the stubborn, stupid old thing from the past. In modern astrology, Saturn is thus seen as the place-holding symbol for the categorical difference between the merely mundane traditional 7 planets and the more highly evolved outer planets. Saturn, in relation to the outer planets, thus represents the limits of an old system, the merely mundane or personal, a less evolved archaic past, the stubbornness of an old world view, a less evolved planet representing an older and less evolved form of astrology. So those are some heavy things for Saturn to pick up when in 2000 plus years, Saturn never represented really any of those things. But if it did have anything to do with tradition or the past, it also had a lot to do with a number of other very mystical categories of experience, mystical archetypal themes and symbolism. So let's talk about that now. Let's talk about the traditional significations of Saturn. By contrast, Saturn's significations in ancient astrology were really, really diverse. Saturn was associated with melancholy, and melancholy was associated with a wide range of internal weather conditions, psychic, emotional, psychological conditions that were associated with melancholy and melancholy with Saturn. Depression is one of them. Saturn is often called depressive or heavy or sort of sorrowful. But it was also associated with wistful longing, which means that you look at the world perhaps as though it is void and that you're probing for something beyond what you see in front of you, this longing for something beyond this world. This was actually associated with melancholics and with Saturn. Severe emotions, not just some people think, oh, Saturnine people, they don't have emotions. No, that's not true at all. In ancient astrology, a Saturnine person or a Saturnine placement could indicate very, very intense and strong and severe emotions. It also was symbolic of grief. Melancholy is associated with grief, and grief with Saturn, and Saturn with melancholy, and around it goes. Hallucinations, delusions, and visions, sometimes nightmares. Dark or somber reveries, insomnia, demonic possession. And so you have a number of different significations for Saturn, including not being able to sleep, or if you think about dark or somber reveries like Mozart's Requiem, these are Saturnine. Saturn was associated with winter, with death, with old age, and with impermanence, all of which were considered to be deeply mystical realities. Yes, there's a way in which death and winter and coldness can relate to depression and heaviness, and there can be this something very earthy and almost bottom line about Saturn. But all of these qualities are also associated very intimately with the boundary between the mortal world, the earthly world, and the realm of the divine, because the nature of this world is impermanent and dead and empty because it's always changing, right? And so you're looking at it like a Buddhist, saying this world is void of anything that lasts. Yogis, of course, say the same thing. So winter, old age, death, and impermanence are the cornerstones of spiritual life, because we have to be able to see through the world, see through its hollowness, so that we don't get deluded into chasing experience after experience, looking for happiness in a world that doesn't provide it to us. So Saturn is realism, but it can be spiritual realism. The spirit needs something beyond the trappings of this world. And so monks, hermits, people who live in isolation, people who contemplate the fluctuating impermanence of the world, who see through it with the deep, wintry gaze. That's Saturn as well. Saturn ruled the sign of Capricorn, which was called the gateway of the gods, and it was associated with the departure of the body, of the spirit from the body at death. Saturn was the dimmest and most distant planet in the heavenly spheres model in the ancient world. And its position in that model put it closest to the realm of the fixed stars and the divine primary motion, the prime mover, and God, which lay beyond. So Saturn was given, for example, the seventh sphere of heaven in Dante's Paradiso, which was a realm where Dante encountered the spirit of people who had dedicated their lives to prayer and contemplation, almost like monks. So what I find so interesting is that you have Saturn associated with mysticism because it's so far from this world. It's essentially, if you think about what happens during winter in the snow, times of year in the zodiac associated with Saturn, Capricorn, and Aquarius, you get this feeling of everything being dead and impermanent and empty and cold. And you feel this vast distance from the world of spring and summer. And it's that kind of space that allows us to contemplate distant, transcendent, invisible, subtle, intangible realms. Uh, and and it helps us to, we need that separation. You need the monastery. You need the quiet, Zen, silent meditation retreat. You need death, and you need the heavy weight of time and its endless permutations and fluctuations to say, well, something more might exist. So Saturn was associated with that. Saturn was also associated with dark weather and trades that took place by cold or wet places like the ocean. And in this sense, Saturn is associated with that which is vast and stretches out beyond where the eye can see. It's the unknown, because remember, Saturn, as the last of the visible planets, was emblematic of the vast, unknown, invisible, immaterial, spiritual realms beyond Saturn. Saturn was associated with deterioration and dampness, though people often think of Saturn as only cold or dry. This is because at an early point in the tradition, Saturn was associated with coldness and dryness. But if you go back even further in the tradition, it's also associated with wetness. Saturn is exalted in the sign of the fall equinox, Libra, which is the sign of the harvest and a sign of justice and judgment, as well as beauty and fairness. So you also have Saturn as associated with something like morality and law, and a sense of crime and punishment. There's a sense of reaping what you've sown. And that's where some of that Lord of Karma signification comes from. In Indian astrology, Saturn was associated with outcasts, and in ancient Greek, the word melas at the root of melancholy also meant dark black, or even a person of dark or black color or disposition. So when you think about, prejudice, racism, bigotry toward a person or a group or someone of a particular orientation, and the way that they experience being an outsider. If you think about someone who's impoverished, living on the streets for one reason or another, and they're outcasts from society in a sense. If you think of the caste system in ancient India and the way that certain people or groups were discarded or put on the outside, those were all associated with Saturn. As the gatekeeper between the visible and invisible, Saturn was thus associated with both the establishment as well as those that were despised or ostracized by the establishment. It's an interesting dichotomy. Saturn can equally represent a criminal, a heretic, or a miser. These are all things that pertain to Saturn. Saturn can be someone who's on the outside of society because they're a criminal. It could be on the outside of society or ostracized on some level because they are they're a heretic. Or they can also represent the hoarding and greed and let me keep mine and, nobody else can have it. That sense of the fear or ostracization of others by a greedy or power-hungry person, kind of a miser. Saturn may represent a black sheep, a wise hermit or recluse, an introvert, or a sectarian of some kind. So you have the outsider, the person who's at a distance from the world, who likes to read in nature, quiet by themselves, away from the world. You also have someone who's maybe more introverted or shy, or sometimes people who are also sectarians. I hang out with my people and not outside of the gates of, the people that are a part of my religious or spiritual group or community. Obviously, there's sects that are more or less opposed to outsiders than others. But the general point is that anytime that you belong to something and it's a kind of a cloistered environment away from the rest of the world, that community becomes like a cloister, just like a monastery. So it becomes something that defines, it provides some place of belonging, but often away from others, away from the rest of the world. Saturn was also said to be the ruler of feigned appearances and was the natural planetary contrary of the sun, who it shares a secret affinity with. Feigned appearances would be like the shadows on the wall of the cave in the in Plato's Republic, but also it can be the dichotomy between Sun and Saturn, because they rule opposite signs in the zodiac, Leo and Aquarius. The dichotomy can also take us to the other side of the sun, where you have the light of the sun in the real world outside of the cave that the prisoner is in the allegory of the cave. And he goes out and to see the light of real truth and real knowledge, the real forms in eternity. And Saturn would be the opposite, the merely feigned appearances, the reflections and shadows of the world that feign to be the real thing. Saturn, in this sense, can be associated with even deception or following a form, but there's no substance behind the form. In mythology, Saturn rules the golden age, but eventually is cast out from his throne and usurped by his son Zeus. And so you also have this idea of Saturn being associated with this kind of golden age, and the sense of once upon a time everything was good, but then it fell apart somehow. So you have this idea of like impermanence associated, impermanence of power, impermanence of kingdoms associated with Saturn through the fact that Saturn is usurped by his son Zeus. So Saturn can be the fondness of the past, but also the ruin of the current regime and the eventual downfall of all things in time. There are also interesting associations between Saturn and the Roman god Janus. There's a dual-faced god that ruled thresholds and looked both backward and forward in time. Interesting that Saturn in Aquarius tends to look toward the future, and Saturn in Capricorn tends to look toward the past. But both with a sense of idealistic longing, separation from something, some ideal in the future or some ideal in the past. So those are some of the traditional significations of Saturn. Let's talk a little bit about the joy of Saturn. Saturn was also said to rejoice in the 12th place, which was called the place of the evil spirit. Now, this is there's a lot to unpack there with the 12th house, which we can't do in this talk, but suffice to say that Saturn has something in common with the topics and themes of the 12th house, like ostracization and abandonment, which we've already talked about as a Saturnine theme, being the outsider, being outcast. But the 12th house also was associated with those themes, as was the planet Saturn, who rejoiced in the 12th house. Loss and grief associated with the 12th house and with Saturn. Exile and imprisonment associated with the 12th house and Saturn. Disease, sickness, and slavery, all associated with the 12th house and with Saturn. Confusion and deception, as well as illusion, all associated with Saturn and the 12th house traditionally. Also insanity and sorcery, confinement and shipwreck, impermanence. The 12th house was specifically seen in relation to the native's loss of control, as the 12th house was understood as having recently fallen away from the helm or the rising place by means of the primary motion. So in other words, the 12th house, right before you're born, whatever whole sign is in the 12th, it most recently was in the first, but has been carried by the primary motion of the sky caused by the rotation of the Earth on its axis to move upward, and that first sign becomes the 12th sign. So the 12th house was associated with the place that most recently had been the first but slid out of it, and the first was associated with the steering wheel of the ship of life. So anything in the 12th has fallen away from or lost control over the ship. Saturn is, of course, associated with wandering and becoming lost. In modern astrology, the 12th house has come to be associated with mysticism, ego loss, and karma, as well as the planet Neptune. And most of those associations have been now given to Neptune, but traditionally they belong to Saturn. So let's talk for a second about a little bit more about Neptune and the discovery chart of Neptune. When you, oops, just one second. In the discovery chart of Neptune, Saturn was closely conjoined with Neptune. So when Saturn was discovered, it was in this very tight conjunction with the planet Neptune in the sign of Aquarius. I find that just absolutely amazing. Why is that important? Because it tells us something perhaps about the nature of the planet. As we're discovering it, we're starting to assign meanings to it. Its appearance happens exactly conjoined with Saturn. Consider the following similarities. Neptune is associated with the dissolving of boundaries, as well as all that is transcendental, mystical, and otherworldly. Saturn was associated with disillusionment, death, winter, disintegration, as well as mystics and contemplatives who saw through the hollowness of the world from a vast distance. You see how similar they are? Neptune is associated with delusions, dreams, intoxications, and madness. Saturn was associated with melancholy, which is a temperament that a temperamental sort of condition that could also be associated with all of those qualities. Neptune is associated with water and confusion. Saturn was associated with water and the darkness of ignorance. So there's, again, a lot actually in common between these two planets. Neptune dissolves that which is permanent. Saturn was associated with old age and decay. Now, to be fair, the planets aren't identical. I don't want to say that exactly, but it seems more than a coincidence to me anyway, ever since I've learned about this, that Neptune came to be associated with the traditional house of Saturn and was discovered in a conjunction with Saturn while also carrying so many similar significations. I think in order to really deeply understand Saturn, you have to look at some charts just to get a picture of how diverse this planet really is. So I want to take a look at a few charts from personal clients and the charts of important historical figures, a few anecdotes maybe from personal clients' charts and the charts of important historical figures. So I have seen a number of really amazing people who have lived Saturn stories that are not at all in touch with that grounded, serious, earthy, practical, conservative, strict, that kind of stuff. It's actually really diverse. Let's look at some historical personalities first. Nina Simone, who was a singer, songwriter, and civil rights activist. She was born with Saturn in the first house of identity, right on the ascendant. You can see it right there. She took her name, Nina Simone, in order to just disguise herself from her family members who believed that jazz and blues are the devil's music. And she also was rejected many times as an artist due to the color of her skin. She took up the mantle of being an outsider and of being a black sheep from her own family. And she took it up in order to become this really amazing artist who forged a new name and a new identity for herself, and also ended up becoming a civil rights activist for people who were being ostracized in many ways and being shown, severe prejudice, racism. So that's Saturn on the ascendant. And in that sense, Saturn marks Nina Simone's life as the outsider. And I think that theme is so deep and spiritually significant, and not a lot of people might think Saturn in the first house, oh, you're going to be depressed. Or someone might think Saturn in the first house, oh, you're going to be a really Saturn type of person. And then generally when we think of Saturn, we don't think of nearly the appropriate range of meanings. How about Timothy Leary? So Timothy Leary was a professor turned LSD researcher. You can see he has Saturn in the 10th house of career. He was famous for saying, turn on, tune in, drop out. He's also criticized for being something of a psychedelic fundamentalist. So you do have perhaps a little of that almost like sectarian, authoritarian quality that sometimes comes up with Saturn. But here's someone whose mantra was essentially drop out of society because of this otherworldly psychedelic experience that he was, popularizing. That's a Saturn dynamic in his chart. That's a powerful Saturn in his career house. Frida Kahlo, another really famous outsider artist, a visionary and outsider artist. Now, she had Saturn in the 8th house, which is a little bit more disturbing in some ways in this case. She explored questions of identity, post-colonialism, gender, class, race in Mexican society. And she's been described as a surrealist or kind of a magical realist. But she also struggled with melancholy after her leg was amputated and is believed to have taken her own life while being very ill in the wake of that. She experienced 2 major depressive episodes and suicide attempts, and both her depression and suicide attempts have also been linked by those who knew her to her marriage. So here you see the 7th house ruler of marriage in the 8th house of death. And so you have this really intense, depressive, melancholic temperament that emerges in relationship to marriage and leads to suicide attempts and so forth. And that's that, in ancient world, melancholy could be a sign of an artistic genius who's just outside the bubble entirely, or a monk, or it could also lead to, major bouts of depression and a feeling of dissociation from the world and even the desire to die or leave the world. Hunter S. Thompson is a kind of visionary gonzo, so-called gonzo journalist. He was born with Saturn in Aries and its fall and retrograde in the 1st house. This is a debilitated Saturn, but he was a maverick and a renegade. And then the 1st house, when you wear Saturn in Mars's sign, like you wear it like it's an army uniform. In his case, it's like a token of his radical dissidence. He was a maverick and a renegade, but also fueled by drugs, melancholy, and madness, and unfortunately also took his own life. One of the things you can see here is that Mars in its fall and retrograde in Aries in Mars's sign is disposed of by Mars in the house of death. So, but these are good examples of people who say, I'm not part of your crew. I'm not part of that crowd. I'm going to do things very differently. And you can see it repeated again and again in really prominent Saturn placements in people's charts. Helena Blavatsky, who was the founder of the Theosophical movement. Now, the Theosophical movement is a blend of science, religion, and philosophy, and she was a writer and a researcher. She was also said to use very coarse, vulgar language, and she had a rough voice. And she was also called a charlatan and a plagiarist by some. And you'll see she had Saturn exactly conjoined with Mars and Mercury in the 3rd house of communication. So you have this writer, researcher, and coarse, vulgar communicator who's also this otherworldly kind of mystical occult personality. There's Saturn right in the mix. So you can start to get a little bit more mystical with this as well. Ram Dass, he was an influential spiritual teacher, helped bring yoga and meditation to the West with his famous book, Be Here Now, which I believe came out in the 60s. And he has Saturn right on the descendant in the 7th house of marriage. Well, he came out as gay in the 1990s, which was a major turning point for his life and professional work, and in some ways marked this very deep point of his own spiritual unfolding as kind of a popular guru in the West. So here, the mark of the outsider Saturn in the house of love, sexuality, marriage. In the ancient world, the 7th house was associated with sexuality. You also have Teresa of Avila, who is a famous Christian mystic and saint. She was a nun and a very otherworldly sort of visionary contemplative mystic. She was also a religious reformer in the Catholic Reformation. She was a writer and, quote, doctor of the church. So she's this really prolific sort of scholarly person, but Saturn is in the 10th house. She's a visionary. She's a mystic. She's very otherworldly, but she's also someone who is part of the kind of counter reformation that happened in the Catholic Church, at which point she became a voice for saying, this is how it needs to change. And that role of being almost not quite the heretic, but she ends up being a saint, but that voice of, I'm standing in relation to what is opposite or other than the status quo. Very common for strong Saturn placements, and in this case for a mystic as well. Sri Ramakrishna, very famous, kind of mystic saint guru, and he was another one who inspired a generation of teachers who ended up bringing yoga to the West, including Vivekananda. And he had Saturn also in the 10th house, like Teresa of Avila, and he was monastic and often slipped into altered states and trances, just like here and there, because he was really dialed in. And really, if you ever want to read an amazing story, read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Very beautiful book. But he's someone who slipped in and out of other altered states and samadhi and trances all the time, and people would have to pick him up. And he was, sort of from a totally different stratosphere. And of course, he inspired a generation of people who would, in some ways unorthodoxly, bring yoga and yoga philosophy to the West. So those are just some chart examples that have meant a lot to me in helping me understand Saturn as I did my research. And it all started for me because I was trying to understand, like I said, the moon in Capricorn in my chart. And every time that people would try to describe that placement and all of the conservative, limited, authoritarian, rigid, all of those themes came up, or time bound or heavy, depressive, I would just be like, well, I don't feel that way. And so there's got to be something more to Capricorn. And Capricorn, the sea goat, has always struck me as such a mystical sign, as has Aquarius. And so I wondered, well, why did ancient astrologers associate this kind of boring, old, traditional Saturn, which is what I was picking up from modern astrologers, right? Like modern astrologers were telling me left and right that the old way is outdated, less evolved, mundane, merely material, and all these outer planets are the bomb. And oh, by the way, Saturn is sort of the emblem for all that old, outdated, unevolved stuff. And I just kept going, no, I don't think that's true. And so as I did my research, there were a few books that were really important to me. One was called Saturn and Melancholy. That was probably the most important book. Also, The Myth of Saturn. That's another really great book. Let me see if I can bring some of these up. Actually, I'll just show them to you so that you can maybe even pick them up on Amazon. But perhaps the Melancholy in Saturn was a really good one. The Myth of Saturn is here it is. No, it's not called The Myth of Saturn. It's called The Greatness of Saturn. Here you can see it right here. The Greatness of Saturn, a Therapeutic Myth by Dr. Robert Svoboda. I love this one. This is great. I'm going to show you another one. There's another book called Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil by Liz Green. Really love that book. Saturn and Melancholy. Saturn and Melancholy. It's a little bit expensive, $65 for the hardcover, but this is the absolute best history of the meaning of Saturn from the ancient time up to now. That's where this talk mainly was mainly inspired by, though I did find it after I had developed all of these conclusions sort of piecemeal. And then I found this and it was like the ultimate coagulator, I guess. So there's some other really good books called Senex and Puer. These are a series of essays by James Hillman. I would recommend this one right here, Senex and Puer Uniform Editions. These are essays simply about the dichotomy between Jupiter and Saturn in some ways, but all the essays on Senex consciousness are very helpful in terms of understanding Saturn as well. And then this book I haven't read yet, but I just skimmed it, and it's like it's definitely going to reiterate everything that this talk has, which is called Saturn Through the Ages Between Time and Eternity by Charles Aubert. So my recommendation would be to check out any of those books if you want to go further. I think that if you look at Saturn in your own chart, what I've seen, and I wanted to just share a few anecdotes, is that when you have Saturn well or like prominently placed in your birth chart, there's often a way in which you're going to experience or encounter being the outsider or coming into contact with people who are very different from you in different areas of the chart, or there's going to be certain areas of life that somehow teach you the lessons of impermanence that may bring a bit of that dark night of the soul, but it also put you in touch with eternity. And Saturn is a very blessed, sacred, beautiful planet in this regard. So remember that, and don't only keep the images of Saturn that are hard, cold, restrained, conservative, restrictive. Elements of that Saturn do exist, but Saturn is also this beautiful, like prismatic watcher on the gates of time and the threshold of eternity, and it's such a deeply mystical planet that teaches us how to be in this world while not being of it. And Saturn transits are often like that in the lives of my clients. I see this constantly. A Saturn in the seventh house transit may bring hardship, Saturn, difficulties around marriage, but it can also bring a deeply spiritual partner into a person's life. It can bring the need for spiritualization of one's sexuality. Saturn in the fourth house can bring difficulties around home and family, but it can also bring you in touch, as the fourth house was traditionally associated with the mysteries, mystery school. Saturn in the fourth is deep occult knowledge and mystery. Saturn in the first house can be hard on health. Okay, fine, basic. But Saturn in the first house is also about wearing that mantle of the outsider as your identity. Saturn in the 10th is doing something sometimes that's unconventional or otherworldly for a living. So, and it's like that through all of the houses. Don't let Saturn be only one thing. Think of Saturn as this planet that sits on the gateway between the status quo and those who are outside of it, between time and between eternity, like that. So I hope that this talk has been like enriching, that you feel like your understanding of Saturn got more mysterious, interesting, and beautiful, and they liberated maybe you a little bit from, ironically, some of the limitations of how we tend to think about Saturn. We can think about Saturn in limited ways. That's a real irony. In some ways, the attempt to say, well, there's just this old Saturn stuff and the old tradition, and it's down there. And there's this other transcendental, otherworldly, mystical stuff, and it's all beyond the outer planets. Ironically, all of that could be thought of as Saturnine in the traditional sense. Whether you're on the mystical, contemplative, higher realm side, or you're like, oh, that's the old status quo, or that's just the merely worldly, or there's the outcast and here's the in crowd. That kind of thinking in general was traditionally associated with Saturn. And so it's something that we have to be aware of. Remember that Saturn rules the opposition in ancient astrology, the aspect, which pits things against one another. You're either in or you're out. You're on this side or you're on that side. But there's also a sense in which this world is impermanent, and we do spiritual things like study astrology because we're seeking that otherworldliness. So Saturn is the potential to be fallen or condemned or decayed, or it's the potential of decay and death and merely mundane things in time. But it's also the planet that by virtue of those experiences in life, we start to grasp the intangible and subtle spiritual dimensions. So I highly recommend, especially the greatness of Saturn. There's a great way of really getting to know Saturn in that book. And it's not a bad thing to also just talk to Saturn a little. If Saturn is transiting your chart, just say a prayer and say, on behalf of the way that you are guiding my relationship with Source, help me to understand the lessons that you're imparting. So that's what I've got for today. Now, this is a talk that I've done without there's a good amount added into this talk. And it could have been broken up into two sections, but I decided to do it in one slightly longer video. So I hope that this was enjoyable for all of you today. And if you end up having any questions about Saturn, you can always email me, info@nightlightastrology.com, and put question about Saturn in the subject line. All right, that's what I've got for you now. I hope that you enjoyed this and that you have a new and deeper relationship with the planet Saturn. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.
Hey everyone, thanks for sticking around. I'm going to tell you about the different rewards that we offer when you donate and support our channel in the year ahead. So you'll find a link to the Kickstarter in the description of this video, in the comments section of this video, as well as on our website, nightlightastrology.com. If you head over there, you'll see at the top of the page there is a menu item that says Kickstarter 2025. You can click on that and be taken over to the Kickstarter campaign page. So once you're there, if you scroll down on the right-hand side, you're going to see different pledge levels and different gifts and sales that we run as a way of saying thank you for your support. So among those, our most popular offering by far are the major discounts that we offer on our training programs. So if you are interested in studying astrology at Nightlight in 2025, whether you're a brand new student or a currently enrolled student who's thinking of taking one of our year 2, 3 horary programs, you're going to find that these are the best rates that we run on the entire year. And we do this as a way of both saying thank you and also of helping us raise funds to support the channel, our staff, and everything we do. So you'll see attend one Nightlight course there. That's about 50% off the total cost of the program and about $500 off the early bird rate. And then you'll scroll down and you'll see that if you bundle 2 courses together, the savings go way up. Bundle 3, they go up even more. I mean, the difference between the 2 and 3 class package is $200. So $200 more, you get 3 of our year-long programs. And if you get all the way to the 4 class pass, then you have all 4 years of our program. You can take them at any pace you like, renew them whenever you like. There's no timeline on when you use these class passes. And you will have all 4 years of content at about 75% off each of the programs individually when you get that bundle. So those are our best savings for sure. Highly recommend those. If you have any questions about our courses or programs, email us info@nightlightastrology.com or look at the website under the classes page, courses page. You'll find information about each of the individual courses we offer. And then if you scroll up, you're going to find some of our other programs that are greatly discounted. Ashley's Herbal Foundations apprenticeship course, which many people are interested in who come through our Moon Circle that Ashley and I lead each month. You scroll up, you're going to find our Masterclass series for 2025, greatly discounted, as well as our Roots and Spheres Moon Circle, greatly discounted. There's hundreds of dollars of savings in each of those. So we really try to make sure that the Kickstarter acts as a good flash sale for all of our programs. You'll then find some really nice prices on previous archive talks, like our 2024 archive masterclass bundle, which is about 30 hours worth of content on specialized topics in astrology. You can see the topics listed in each of the bundles as you scroll through. 2023's masterclass bundle, huge savings on those and a lot of really great content. You'll see a few reading options as you continue to go from the bottom to the top. You'll see the 2025 year ahead mini reading. There's only 30 of these. These are individualized birth chart readings that I do, looking at the most significant transit in your birth chart for 2025. I record those personally. You'll then see that there is an Ask 3 Horary Questions option where you can get 3 horary questions to redeem whenever you'd like within the year ahead. Those are kind of yes, no predictive questions. Will I get the job? Will we get together? Things like that. Then you'll see the Astrology for Complete Beginners course is also discounted through the Kickstarter. This is a great 10 hours worth of content for people who are brand new to astrology. So whether that's you or maybe a gift for somebody else. And then you're going to see some individual master classes that are greatly discounted from the past year. So all of 2024's masterclass series are the archives of which 8 to 10 hours each are on sale. And then scroll up a little bit more and you'll see one of our most popular offerings, which are the year ahead horoscope readings. These year ahead horoscope readings include 30 to 45 minutes of a breakdown of all the major transits of the year ahead for each sun and rising signs. You get all of them with this package, which is a great deal. It's like 10 hours worth of content, 8, 9, 10 hours, somewhere in there. I haven't finished recording all of them yet. So as of the time I'm recording this, I'm anticipating it'll land around 10 hours. But yeah, anyway, so you scroll up, you'll see those horoscope videos will all be delivered to you right around January 1st when the Kickstarter ends. Scroll up a little bit more, you'll find The Oracle Speaks, which is my book, and this is being released chapter by chapter. It is a book about the inner experience of learning to speak with oracles. And it is being released chapter by chapter in both text and audiobook form, so you can listen along to my new book. And that takes us up to the Astrology of 2025 video. This, for your donation at the $50 level, gives you an exclusive talk breaking down all of the major astrological transits of 2025. I look in depth at some of the biggest things happening in the year ahead and break them down in advance. And that's the only place I release that video or that take on the whole year ahead. Finally, at the very top, the most basic level of donation, you'll see the Astrology of 2025 calendar. This is a PDF calendar we design and make that allows you to track and move along with the astrology as the year unfolds. This is also great if you want to track what we're going to be talking about week by week on my channel. You'll get a glimpse at the biggest transits of each day and month and week. And that will give you some sense of where we're heading with our coverage of the astrology on the channel as the year unfolds. So again, any questions about any of the rewards that you see, email us info@nightlightastrology. Link is in the description, comments, or on the website, nightlightastrology.com. Help us get to 1,937 backers by January 1st. We deeply appreciate your contribution. We try to make sure we have some really special rewards to say thank you when you contribute. All right, take it easy. Bye.